Hello, my name is Tracy Hames. I'm the Executive Director for Wisconsin Wetlands Association. The video you are about to view was recorded in January 2021 as a virtual fireside chat with Leigh Fredrickson. Dr. Drew Fowler, wetland research scientist with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, is my co-host today. Those of you who regularly attend Wisconsin Wetlands Association's annual Wetland Science Conference have likely interacted with Leigh, or at least you've probably attended one of his passionate and informative presentations. Drew and I are pleased and honored to have had this rare opportunity to explore decades of wetland science, research, and management with a man who has played a large part in advancing wetland science and application. Now, because of the length of our comprehensive tour through the decades of wetland science and application, we've split this discussion into three parts. Part one covers Leigh's early years, and parts 2 and 3 address the lessons learned and the wisdom gained through decades of thoughtful research and observation. I hope you enjoy this discussion as much as we did. Hello, my name's Tracy Hames. I'm Executive Director with Wisconsin Wetlands Association. And tonight we're really excited to be having a conversation with Leigh Fredrickson. And we'll be talking a lot about all kinds of things related to wetlands and wetland management, waterfowl and other. So I'd like to introduce you to my co-host, and this is Drew Fowler with Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. He's a natural resources research scientist. And Drew, say hello.
Hey guys, thanks for having me, Tracy. I appreciate the opportunity to join you tonight. I wanted to along with Tracy, introduce the rest of Wisconsin Wetland Association to Leigh Fredrickson. Leigh could be introduced in a variety of different ways, but we're going to get into some of that in our interview and discussion with him tonight. So I just think succinctly, Leigh Fredrickson is a retired wetland and waterfowl professor from the University of Missouri. He was the director of the Gaylord Memorial Laboratory in Southeast Missouri. And in 2018, he was awarded the Aldo Leopold Memorial Award from the TWS, the Wetlands or the Wildlife Society. And Leigh and I have a personal connection too. I first met Leigh in 2010 at his house. One of the first assignments that my master's advisor had for me as a new wetland student was to send me to one of Leigh's wetland ecology field workshops. And that's where Leigh and I met. He opened up his house to me, and that began now a 10-year relationship of thinking about wetlands. And so really proud and excited to have Leigh with us tonight. Leigh, welcome.
Thank you, Drew. It's a pleasure to be with you. Wisconsin has a special place in my heart.
Well, and you've been to Wisconsin with Tracy and I a number of times, and so now because of the pandemic, we weren't able to make it work this year, but we're glad to meet virtually tonight and do this interview. Leigh, I just want to start off and maybe just give you the opportunity to introduce yourself to the Wetlands Association. Can you tell us a little bit about where you were raised, and at large, what sparked your passion for conservation and wetlands in particular?
Of course, I was very fortunate to be born in a family that had great comfort in the outdoors, and I had a strong connection with the land because of my ancestors that were pioneers in Nebraska and Iowa. In addition to that, that I was born, like over 8 decades ago within a mile of the Missouri River floodplain. And that was at a time in which major dams had not yet been closed. And so here I was in this family of modest means. And my dad was a cooper in the packing house industry, and that's the way they cured and transported meats before World War II. And so one of the things that he did annually was that he would go to these oxbow lakes on the Missouri River floodplain, and he would collect cattail leaves because that was used as a sealant between the staves and oak barrels to make them watertight. So my guess is probably about 1942 was the first time that I went to a floodplain with my dad. And I was lucky he took me everywhere. He did things. So I got all kinds of unique experience in the outdoors. So anyway, I got to see this wonderful habitat that was full of birds and fish. And he was also a fisherman. So we often went back to these locations to enjoy it for hunting and fishing. So I got this unique experience, this very dynamic habitat in a large floodplain situation. And I had other unique opportunities because as a kid, this was during World War II and there were victory gardens. And so we lived on the outskirts of Sioux City, Iowa, and there were big plots of victory gardens. And these people often were fighting pocket gophers. So they hired me as a young kid to trap pocket gophers. So I started to learn some of the basics of observation, testing, your skills, that what you need to look for, how you need to set these traps. And so that kind of expanded, through all of my years up until I went to college. And so I felt very fortunate to have those experiences. And I already recognized that the land had changed dramatically because my grandmother, who was born in 1881 in Nebraska, when she was a teenage girl, her responsibility was to shoot prairie chickens for the table every day. And when I was born, there was not a single prairie chicken in Stanton County, Nebraska, and there probably wasn't a prairie chicken within 200 miles of Stanton County. So I could see, this transition from great abundance of wildlife to, extinction or extirpation of wildlife. And so those kinds of things had an important influence on thinking about these sorts of things. And I had an uncle I had two uncles actually that were very much involved in breaking the prairie of the Red River Valley of Minnesota. And so they started out with big, 15 or so horses in a team that would break this prairie. It was so deep and, with prairie grasses. And then they switched over to steam engines. And so my ancestors were also involved in the destruction of the habitats for the things that, I wanted to protect when I became a professional. So I had all these unique connections, in my early years. And I always knew that I wanted to do something professionally in the outdoors. But the way that vocational direction was in my high school, it was like zero in anything that had to do with the environment. So the environment was not taking any precedent. In that time, after World War II, because of the war machine, engineering had been really important in building the machinery necessary to win a war. And so you could get a job in engineering really easily. And I happened to be skilled in 3D perceptions and in mathematics. And so all my testing indicated I should be an engineer, but I was trying to find a better place for a niche that I would fit personally. So I went ahead and started in engineering at Iowa State College in 1957. But once I was on campus, I learned of a thing called zoology club. And my gosh, here was a program, a curriculum in which you were being educated about all these wonderful things that I had been experiencing since as a kid, but it was from a scientific perspective and not from a lay perspective. And I said, wow, I've got to get involved here. And so one of the things in engineering you had to do every week, you had to go and listen to a different type of engineering. And it was probably halfway through the quarter system, and a civil engineer was in charge of the program. And this particular professor I would consider lazy. And so what he did, he showed us a movie prepared by Gulf Oil, and these bulldozers were shoving over cypress trees. And I said, okay, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to fight you for the rest of my life. And I got up from that class. I went to hit my engineering advisor and said, I'm changing over to fish and wildlife management. And so this was but I really didn't have a fish and wildlife management professor. I had an entomology professor, but he was very good in opening opportunities. And that's another important thing that resulted in what I would call reasonable success, is that I had all of these wonderful potential, because I had the right gender for the time and I had the right race for the time. So if you're a white male, that you had opportunities you didn't have as a woman, you didn't have as color. So it was really unique to go to a place and have someone that recognized someone that might have some potential. And this professor, entomology Professor LaFoon, took me down and introduced me to Paul Arrington in the basement of the science building. And Paul Arrington was not highly respected by the faculty. And he sat in a dingy old room with a pull chain light behind this old oak desk, and his bookshelves were bricks and planks. And so this was an internationally known scientist, you know, that I'd had no idea what the meaning of all this. I didn't know what a PhD was, but anyway, this was the first step that someone identified potential in someone and began to open up doors after doors so that I could move forward and kind of move toward a career that I felt like, you know, was in my heart from the early days of my youth. So that's kind of a quick summary of how I got to in the professional business of wetlands. So it's really different. So many people today, they didn't have those experiences, you know, but I knew from an early age that I wanted to be in the outdoors. And my favorite outdoor sites were wetlands with the smell of hydrogen sulfide, you know, and this great diversity of animals and plants that are so productive. It's just totally amazing.
Great. Well, thanks for that. You covered all three questions we had in that answer on our introduction. So Drew, I think we can start with your question under early career, because I think he also covered the first question I had under early career. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Tracy, you're talking about the first question on early career, you said?
I think you covered that on how you ended up getting into school and what attracted you to that.
Yeah. So Leigh, let's jump ahead a little bit just in timeline. So, you know, you transferred over from engineering into fisheries and wildlife. You ended up getting both a master's and a PhD. Your PhD was with Milton Weller, correct?
That is correct. Yes.
And after you got your
PhD.
That was just a PhD. What do you mean by that?
Okay, and so you have to understand that I was from a family of modest means, and so when I went to Iowa State College, I had $300 in my pocket, and so the first quarter it cost $75 for room, board, and tuition. But you had 3 of those time periods, plus you had to eat and have a place to do whatever you needed to do. And so I started working as soon as I got to Iowa State, and eventually I tended to be working about 40 hours. And so my strategy as a student was, I knew that I didn't have the time to invest in classes to get a good grade. My idea was at that time is my goal was to get a 2-point so I could stay in college and get a degree. And so, you know, if my perspective is that I have to make an assessment this first week of class. What level can I probably get as a grade in order to keep that 2-point? And so I make the decisions in the first week how I would invest my time to be able to do that. And so I don't mind getting a D-. You know, you can still learn a whole lot about it, but my goal is not to try and impress a professor. My goal was trying to, the limited time I had to do all these things, I wanted to get as much out of each class as possible to try and have the background you would need, to get a job in the future. So because of that, because my undergraduate advisor recognized that I might have the potential to get a PhD, I didn't know what a PhD was, that he said, if you will take these kinds of courses, I can get you scholarships. And so he got me a scholarship because I was willing to take organic chemistry, physics, and higher math. But I knew that I couldn't get good grades in those, but that's fine. You still learn a lot. And so one really cool thing as a senior is I took a lot of math. I had 5 quarters of math. Okay, when I took this physics course, there were like 18 kids in my recitation section. Okay, out of the 18, 12 flunked. Of the 6 that made our class, that the highest score was a C, that was me. And the reason I had the highest score is I had 5 quarters of math. The people that got D's only had 4 quarters of math. And so all these things work together, as a background to make things work. So anyway, when I did get to the point that I wanted to go on to graduate school, I applied all over the country. I didn't get any offers all around the country, but the best thing I did as an undergraduate, Milt Willer had identified me. Well, I should mention, first of all, that when I got into fisheries and wildlife, that there were only 2 other people in the program. And one of these people was working for Paul Arrington. And when he found I was interested in marshes, he said, you need to meet Milton Weller. So he took me up and I met Milt Weller, and it's like, holy smokes, this is unbelievable. Here's a professor, he's got decoys on his desk. All of his books are on birds. My gosh, there's a picture of a marsh on his wall. My gosh, I got to get to know this. And so I couldn't get a job in the department because my grades are so damn low. But Weller recognized my determination. And so finally, as a junior, he hired me as one of his primary assistants. And what I learned from him as an employee was better than any classes by far. Not only did I learn about scientific procedures and techniques, but I learned about how a university operated because I had to go buy things. And, you learn that, well, there just isn't this unlimited supply of money. If you want a pencil in a university, someone has an account. You have to figure out how to justify getting that, and you have to go over. So I learned all these wonderful things. And I also learned that women play a really important role in how a university works. And so a woman that was in charge of the administrative assistant in the unit, I got to be good friends with her. And so she trusted me. So I had access to all kinds of things because I was employed at Willer that no one else could get. Even this professor students couldn't get access to this. I had access to this. But you just keep your mouth shut. You don't let anyone else know that it's happening. And you try and do the best you can to take that opportunity and to move forward. And so I had all these wonderful experiences. But because I would select classes that I could do well in, that you have to understand that Weller was not on the graduate faculty when I was a senior. So I was looking for a slot. I get all these, letters that you didn't make it. But there was a parasitology professor that I worked with, and I really liked what he did. And he offered me a graduate assistantship. So I accepted that. And then like a few weeks later, Weller got on the graduate faculty, and he asked me if I wouldn't be a student working on blasted potholes in Northwest Iowa. And I said, well, I've already accepted this. And we talked about it. And he said, I think you should proceed. And so my program was really different because I took things like physics and chemistry and philosophy and so forth, that I didn't take as many wildlife courses. So I focused more on wildlife courses as a master's, even though I was focused on parasitology. And parasitology is really a wonderful way to look at ecology because of the close interconnection, because of hormones and animals in all these different settings. And so I had this unique background of different kinds of courses that you can take in a quarter system. So I had this vast array of background information that I could work on. And of course, I was lucky in that because of the timing of when I had to focus on my master's research, I was able to help the student that Weller selected for that pothole. And so I assisted him for all of his field work. And so I was building this, deep relationship with Weller. And so Weller wanted me to go to some other university. He felt that it was, too much inbreeding, but I stuck it out. In fact, I was offered a position on Isle Royal with Durwood Allen, which I turned down because, I'm not a charismatic person. I selected coots, so hydrogen sulfide and coots, that fits me better than some.
Yeah. Well, Leigh, let me ask you this real quick. So I'm going to fast forward in your career a little bit to the point where, you've mentored over 50 graduate students of your own, and they all studied a diverse topics. Some of them now have their own research programs, but you largely, the two themes were probably wetlands and waterfowl. I want to ask you a question about wetlands, and then I think Tracy's going to ask you a question about waterfowl, and then we're going to kind of circle back to wetlands again. But when it comes to the students that you had, you've gotten to mentor quite a few. And
waterfowl, water birds, not waterfowl.
Water bird.
Yes.
Okay. Well, we'll circle back to that for sure. Not just waterfowl, like you said, but water dependent birds. Certainly expand beyond what we would consider waterfowl today. But of the students that you had, you mentored quite a few of them. You mentored all of them in different capacities. You talked about Milton being one of your really influential mentors for you yourself. What was it about your relationship with him, or what did he do to help you think about wetlands? One of the things you do now, and you helped your students do, is think about wetlands, but you do it in a unique way, or you probably changed the paradigm. So what did you learn from Milton in terms of how to think about wetland systems?
Well, I think that the primary thing is that you need firsthand experience through observation. That's extremely important. And the reason it is that wetlands go through cycles. And so the length of the cycle is very different. So the cycle in Hawaii might be 1.5 years or 2 years. The cycle down here in the southern swamps is like 7 years. On the prairie, it's 10 to 15. In the mountains of the West, it's 30 years. And so if you're in the West, you have to spend most careers last about 30 to 40 years, but it's very unlikely you're going to be in the same position. And so taking the time to understand that there's this variability over a temporal scale in which these changes occur, that takes observation. And the more cycles you go through, the deeper your understanding is, because all cycles aren't the same length. Sometimes they're only 3 years, sometimes they're 7 years, sometimes they're 10 years. And the challenge is when you're in the cycle, you don't know what that cycle looks like until the cycle's complete. And then you can look back at your history to see how you should interpret what those findings are. And so that, I think, is the foundation of what Weller was passing on to me through the, Weller Spatcher paper, in which they identify these different periods in a marsh cycle.
Yeah, certainly. And that's what I think that's what people have found so fascinating, is that around the time when you were a student, people were realizing that wetlands aren't static systems. They're dynamic, and they exist in these cycles. Was there a moment for you where that really clicked in your mind, or was that kind of just a slow evolved process?
No, because I was familiar with that work that he did, and I was in the field with him on those sites. that when I was working with Strohmeyer, was a student that did blasted pothole study, that you have to understand, we were in a huge drought that ended about 1961. So when we were doing that work, we were seeing this reflooding of marshes, which ended up in a really productive period. And so there was no waiting, basically. I had learned about these cycles, and then, man, I got to see it in front of my eyes. You know, that's really unique. So the other thing that was really helped me a great deal with Weller is that he allowed me to spend over an entire year on my study area. And I came to appreciate the fact that what you see in summer, it reflects on what happened in winter. And if you don't spend that much time every day going out and look at these marshes, that it's really difficult to understand those changes over time. And so I would say one of our greatest weaknesses today in the education of wetland scientists is they don't have the same opportunity I had to understand temporal scale. Temporal scale is really critical. So there's a temporal scale on an annual basis or temporal scale on a longer term basis of a cycle, but then there's this really long temporal scale that you only come to appreciate by taking the opportunity of using techniques that link past environments with current environments. And so all these things build upon this basic understanding to give you a level of comfort. And the way I look at wetlands, this is like the ultimate uncertainty. So if you don't have a feeling of confidence in this arena of uncertainty, I don't think you could ever be a good wetland scientist, because outcomes can change so dramatically, you know, as soon as these climatic cycles kick in. And you may go into a drought that lasts for many years. You may go into a really wet cycle. It could be a really short punch in that direction, or it could be an extended one. And so all that leads to this high level of uncertainty that I find that the lay public in general is very uncomfortable with.
Good stuff. Yes.
That's a good point.
All right. Let's jump over a little bit to birds, waterfowl, water birds. Talk a little bit in your early career about the state of waterfowl, water bird conservation, and how things have evolved over time to where they are today. And maybe also a little bit in your thoughts on where do we go from here. So the state of, in your early career, how things have evolved, and thoughts on where we should be turning our attention.
So, you know, any of us that have lived over the last 80 years, I mean, the transition in knowledge and understanding is phenomenal. And so when I started in this business, the word wetlands was not on the table. They were called swamps or marshes. And it was just like, this is a system. This is the name of the system, but there's nothing about the processes that go on. And there wasn't any recognition of all the abiotic factors that drive those systems. And so we were really naive about that, but we were as naive about the birds in the system, because it wasn't until Lyle Souls did a study on the Delta Marsh that was published in Prairie Ducks in 1955 that we had a better understanding about the fact that most ducks do not nest in the marsh. They nest on the uplands surrounding the marsh. That's a fundamental piece of understanding that we didn't have in place. And so many of the marshes I worked on in the 1960s, that they were purchased during the drought. And guess what? They didn't buy any uplands. In some cases, the boundaries of which they owned was in the middle of the marsh. This is amazing. So this whole area of the connection between uplands and wetlands was not appreciated until the 1950s. And so that piece of information was really critical. Then then the next piece of information that was really critical is all the details of life histories of birds. And so I was extremely fortunate because in the late 1960s, when I was just getting started, that some of the leading scientists in ornithology, like Farmer and King and other people around the world that dealt with endocrinology and so forth, we began having meetings at Patuxent. So this goes back to a really important connection with Weller. Weller came from Missouri. Missouri is a leader in conservation. Their conservation department is not driven by politics. In Iowa, if the Democrats got in, all this conservation aides were Democrats. If the Republicans got in, it switched to Republicans. That's not the case in Missouri. And so I started meeting these people in Missouri in the 1950s. And so, for example, I met John Rogers, the director of the lab that I took over as a second director, before I ever thought there might be an opportunity to work in the state of Missouri. So this connection with Missouri was really profound because Missouri was a leader in things like predation studies, so many things, food habit studies, and these were my mentors in Missouri. And they would say, you're going with us to DC because you're going to go listen to these people. And so here's this, dumb kid, naive kid in the back of the room listening to these world scientists discuss this stuff. So this was a unique opportunity again, simply because of the people you have an attachment with and your willingness to listen to them, your willingness to travel with them and being comfortable, when you're working with powerful people. But anyway, that was really foundational for me because then in the 1970s, there was an AOU meeting that focused on avian energetics. And there's a book published on avian energetics that came out of that meeting. And that was a really good connection for me because of when I was in that parasitology program, I took all kinds of physiology and histology and so forth. So I understood a lot of these interconnections. And so it was easy for me to step in and take this information and try to apply it into a context of understanding how birds dealt with the environments. And so I'm a habitat guy, but the habitat, and the way I look at it, there's an attachment of the life history of these animals, and that you have to understand what the animals need, how much they need it, when they need it, for how long. And that's where energetics come in. And so it's like, wow, this is amazing that you can use energetics to come up with information that managers need to make good decisions. And so you're not talking about this is a right plant you need in your area. You're talking about this is a kind of nutrition these animals need, and that's different context. That's really powerful for managers if you can do that. And so that, enabled me to move forward with a goal that I developed as a graduate student, because when I worked on those marshes in Northwest Iowa, the manager at that site was unusual because he had a master's degree from Oklahoma, and he worked under one of the leading ornithologists in the country. But he worked on groove-billed annies, and now he's managed a prairie marsh system in Northwest Iowa. I mean, he understood the scientific method, but he didn't have the right background to make those decisions. And so what did he do? Every night he'd come down to the cabin with a 6-pack of beer. And so this is when I learned about the diagonal knob, because we were getting up at 4 in the morning every day, and he'd show up with his beer and he wanted us to drink beer with it. So I and the other graduate student, we'd take turns trying to stay awake and answer Glenn's questions. And so it became obvious that here's where I had some disagreement with Weller, because just because you have a degree doesn't mean you might have the ability to clearly understand what the publication says. You may need some intermediary that helps you articulate it with the right terms and the right format to get an outcome that you really want on the land. And so I could see that I would like to fill that niche because I'm really a dirtball guy. You know, I grew up with farmers and so forth. And so I can kind of talk their lingo and communicate with them. Even though you disagree with them, you can still communicate with them to pick out the important things that's going to enable them to be successful. And so this opportunity I had in Missouri, because of the state of Missouri and the way they dealt with conservation and the background I had with the technical information, that I was in a unique situation to have the opportunity to provide information that might make a difference on the landscape. And so that's what's, you know, I don't care if we get an award. What I love is you go to a place and the guy's shaking his finger at you. This is the way it should be. And that's what you told him 5 years ago. Then you know you're successful. You know, when he's shaking your finger at you and telling you what to do. Yes, good. And it's perfect if they don't even understand where that information came from. That's the very best reward of all.
So Leigh, I've heard you say before that at the beginning of your career, you would always go out in the field with a pair of binoculars. And
Yep.
Towards the end of your career, you went out not with binoculars, but with a soil probe. Why
Right.
the change?
Well, that was one of the great things by coming down here, because this close relationship between the lab is located on the Duck Creek Conservation Area. And it's adjacent to the Mingo National Wildlife Refuge. And so here we have 28,000 acres of public lands that's an outdoor laboratory. And I was naive when I came here because I thought it represented, you know, really relatively untouched habitats, which is totally wrong. This has been the most screwed up habitats, but you have to have the experience to understand that that's the way it is. And so when we had some success, I should go back and tell you that the reason I got involved in the two things I spent most of my career on professionally was looking at green tree reservoirs and moist soil management. You know, and this is where the birds came in, this is where the plants came in, this is where the bugs came in, this intermeshing. Okay, so again, to show the importance of, you know, support. I arrived here June 1, 1967. 2 weeks later, I was asked by Ted Shanks, who was a wildlife division chief, and Tom Basket, who was a unit leader. He said, you need to go to Baton Rouge and go to a marsh symposium. Like, yeah, really? You know, I'm in a hardwood forest. Why to a marsh symposium? But they understood that these were good ecologists, the best in the country would be at that meeting. So I got to meet these people. And one of them was, we call him Big John Davis, who was an outstanding Fish and Wildlife Service manager, who had been mentored by an LSU professor. His name escapes me right now, but he was known for as a botanist. And this Big John was one of his students. And so he happened to be the assistant manager at Mingo. And he discovered the tremendous productivity of annual vegetation on this refuge. Even though the refuge was purchased to be cleared and plant corn for ducks, this manager recognized the importance of this natural vegetation. He said, what you need to do with your career, he said, you need to start studying moist soil. He said, we don't know much about it. At the same meeting, I met a forester. His name was Ray Palermo from Louisiana. And he was the forester in the backwater area next to Catahoula Lake. And he said, you know, we're starting flooding these forests. We don't know anything about it. He said, I want you to stop on the way home to look at this forest. He said, I want you to start studying it. So 2 weeks after I got here, I was given the opportunity to go somewhere to experience expertise of the very highest level, that I got ideas that I could take back home and start to implement with my own research on this site. And so that kind of thing becomes really unique, that, you know, to have those opportunities. So you have to take them. Anyway, I don't know where I'm going with it, but anyway, it was a really cool part of my career to have that opportunity. Oh, the other thing I should say, the other opportunity I had in 1970, which really ties in with energetics, is that one of the professors at Iowa State got involved in Antarctica, which he sucked in Weller to do. Weller couldn't go there in 1970, and he asked me to go in his place. So here I was, this naive, dumb, stupid kid that was sent to Antarctica as a senior scientist in 1970. And this is when I learned about climate change, because two of the people that were under me were climate scientists. And they're coming to me and saying, look at this information. This is stuff from the Industrial Revolution that's above Antarctica in 1970. And it had been above Antarctica decade before that. It's like, holy smokes, this is really great information. But in terms of waterfowl, I had an opportunity to look at Adelie penguins. And these penguins walk in a great distance with this big fat reserve, and they form a pair, they pick a site, they build a nest, they lay an egg, and it takes 34 days of incubation. Once the egg is laid, the female walks back to the ocean and the male incubates for about 17 days, and then they switch. And so I got to thinking, wow, this is a big bodied bird. Those birds are full of fat. I wonder how that fits in with ducks. And so that's what gave me the impetus to begin to look at, highly mobile species that move over long distance. How do they do this energetically? And so that led to my interest in looking at cross seasonal effects.